Anthropic, one of the major AI companies, has announced Claude Mythos Preview, an AI model that the startup says is too dangerous to release publicly. And that's because they say that it's exceptionally good at finding and exploiting cybersecurity weaknesses. Now, Anthropic also reported that during testing, Mythos got around the controls that were supposed to keep it safely locked. It gained internet access and it emailed a researcher while they were eating a sandwich in the park. Of course, the responses to Mythos have been measured. Just kidding, there's been panic. Lots of panic. The kind that compelled several governments to hold emergency meetings about AI being misused to take down critical infrastructure. And because almost everything we rely on in the real world runs on software, airports, hospitals, transport networks, and all of them have been completely shut down by cyber attacks in recent years. This means that the question around Mythos, irrespective whether you're a policymaker, a technologist, or a social worker, should concern you directly. If it would get into the wrong hands, and it's as capable as Anthropic claims, the consequences could be catastrophic. So what's the story? Now let's look at whether the hype is actually justified, what's actually at stake, and why specifically two groups are now sounding alarm bells. If you're new here, I'm Walter Pasquarelli. I spent the better part of a decade advising governments and businesses on AI strategy and policy. If you find this content interesting, consider subscribing. What is Mythos and how good is it actually? Mythos first came to light on March 26, when Fortune magazine found an unpublished Anthropic blog post about the model on the company's website. But it was not really until April 7th that Anthropic confirmed its existence. And it really started making headlines when it said that their model had already found thousands of high-severity vulnerabilities, including some in every major operating system and web browsers that people like I use essentially every day. So this is what the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, said happened.
We haven't trained it specifically to be good at cyber. We trained it to be good at code, but as a side effect of being good at code, it's also good at cyber.
According to Anthropic, Mythos succeeded 57% of the time at turning known flaws into working attacks, while their next best model, which is Opus 4.6, was below 1%. Because of that, they've said that Claude Mythos Preview will not be made available to the general public. Instead, Anthropic launched an initiative called Project Glasswing. The idea behind this initiative is that a few companies would essentially get private access to Mythos, find and fix weaknesses in their own systems before anyone else can exploit them. Then they would be sharing the findings so that everyone else could benefit. And for that, they handpicked a number of major companies. Think of Google, Apple, the Linux Foundation, as well as some other actors in the financial services industry, such as, for example, JP Morgan. News about AI creating utopia or essentially destroying the economy and the world are pretty standard by now. They've been flooding social media. So could this all be just hype? The one thing that I teach in both my keynotes, my AI literacy programs, as well as my advisory work is that typically you should be taking these kinds of big claims with a pinch of salt. And if you've been in the AI world long enough, the too dangerous to be released slogan might also seem familiar. Just have a look at this news article from a few years ago. So this one came from OpenAI back in 2019. Back then, the concern was that releasing language models could essentially lead to wild-scale disinformation or what we know nowadays as AI slop. But if anything, we know now that this put OpenAI firmly on the map back then. And Anthropic too has, especially now as it is eyeing an IPO, a clear interest in talking up its own products, particularly to increase its valuations. And it is working to some extent. So they have reportedly surpassed OpenAI in revenue with $30 billion, and investors are now valuing it at $800 billion, which is nearly double what they were valued just in February of the same year. And they do stand to benefit financially directly from Project Glasswing. So Anthropic said that they would commit $100 million in usage credits to get Project Glasswing going. But after that, participants can essentially keep using Mythos at about 5 times what Anthropic would normally charge for Opus, which is currently its most powerful model. So the company absolutely stands to make money from this. Now, others have argued that Anthropic may actually be overstating Mythos capabilities. So here's what one cybersecurity researcher told Bloomberg.
Using AI to find vulnerabilities is not a unique capability. What I think is interesting about Mythos is it's supposed to be the most powerful model yet. And I have to say, like, there is a contention here. I disagree with that because I think one of the things you see is that, the vulnerabilities that they've actually surfaced and disclosed are not impossible to find, not with a closed source model like Mythos, but also with small, tiny, open source models.
But that said, this time, I think the threat is real. And here's why. So, how good is Mythos? This is what the evidence says. The UK's AI Safety Institute has actually already done some testing on the model and published its assessment just this week. This is what it reads. In controlled evaluations, where Mythos Preview was explicitly directed and given network access to do so, we observed that it could execute multi-stage attacks on vulnerable networks and discover and exploit vulnerabilities autonomously, tasks that would take human professionals days of work. They continue, it is at least capable of autonomously attacking small, weakly defended and vulnerable enterprise system, which, by the way, is what characterizes most businesses nowadays. Now, they do add some caveats, and they say that essentially in real testing environments, there might be some additional security measures in place, and for that reason, they cannot 100% say whether Mythos Preview will be able to attack more well-defended system. But if anything, the message that the AI Safety Institute makes is pretty clear. Every incremental step change in AI appears to be mainly an objective that is just waiting to be beaten. And similar as we saw, for example, in the case of AI-made designs, where everyone said, oh, AI image and video generators are terrible. They make these seven-handed fingers. Just with a simple update, those problems were essentially solved, and we're now essentially scratching on the surface of hyperrealism. But the second reason why this really doesn't just look like a marketing stand is look at who showed up for Project Glasswing. So we have Apple, we have Google, we have CrowdStrike. Google competes directly with Anthropic in AI. They probably wouldn't be sitting at that same table unless the threat is real. So as far as the capabilities of Mythos are concerned, it really does appear to be a case of two things being true at once. Now, I don't deny the fact that this may have been a really convenient opportunity for a marketing scoop, but at the same time, the evidence does suggest that Mythos, if not AI as a whole, is moving towards capabilities that are surpassing human systems. That means that we're now in a race against time. Because until now, the kinds of cyber attacks, at least of this scale, did require some actual expertise. And if Mythos would be put out there, that capability might now be in the reach of amateurs, or people like you and I, and would it accelerate professionals' ability to create catastrophes? And I really want to give credit to Dario's approach. So give companies a head start, let them use Mythos to essentially patch the weaknesses before anyone else finds them. So the problem is not much of an Anthropic issue, so I believe have acted in the right manner, but rather that there is no law, that there is no regulation, not at the national, not at the international level, that would force other companies and actors to actually do the same thing. At the current pace of AI development, it's probably months, not years, before a company that might be less careful and less responsible in the US or elsewhere would release a model with similar capabilities. And when that happens, that head start is essentially gone. This is why specifically two groups are now terrified. The first one, as one might predict, are of course governments and national security. Now you might remember in the UK in 2024, a cyber attack on a blood testing company led to more than 10,000 appointments across London hospitals to being cancelled, and it was later linked even to the death of a patient. Just last year, Polish officials said that they had foiled a cyber attack that could have cut water supplies to a major city. This is where you start understanding where governments are really panicking. And Anthropic said last week that it's been in ongoing discussions with the US government about what Mythos actually can do, both offensively and defensively. But it should be said that the US government and Anthropic have a bit of a history. So the Trump administration is not exactly enamored with Anthropic, because Anthropic refused just a few months ago to let the military use its tool for potentially mass surveillance of Americans and develop fully autonomous weapons. They've now banned government agencies and the military from using its technology, and they even called Anthropic publicly a radical left woke company. That hostility is probably going to have to soften simply because the national security implications of models like Mythos are too big to ignore. But it clearly won't be a friction relationship either. And here's why. The Economist reported that governments spend years stockpiling undiscovered security flaws in their software, and especially the ones that is being used by other countries across the world. So essentially, governments save them up. And if a conflict were ever to arise, they have a direct line of attack, a low-hanging fruit if we want. So if Project Glasswing would work and it would patch all those flaws, it would essentially disarm many of America's own cyber weapons. And I'm not sure how that would go down. But that could also explain why, apart from the UK's AI Safety Institute, most countries, and especially Europe, have been largely sidelined. Politico spoke to officials from 8 national European cyber agencies. To date, only Germany said that they had even started conversations with Anthropic. The European Commission said to Politico that they're currently assessing possible implications against European legislation, such as the European AI Act, which to me feels a little bit redundant because if you consider cyber attacks by state or non-state actors are usually already illegal to begin with. But for Europe, this really exposes something that is deeply uncomfortable, but also already well known. Number one is the fact that they do not have any control or at least very little influence over American AI companies. And on the other hand, it really creates another urge for them to develop more sovereign domestic capabilities that would ultimately lead to actors that represent some of the values that they hold so dearly. But the second group, which might have been a little bit more surprising, are bankers and financial services. And you'll understand why in just a minute.
The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and Fed Chair Jay Powell summoned Wall Street leaders to an urgent meeting on concerns that the latest AI model from Anthropic will usher in an era of greater cyber risk.
They wanted to make sure that banks essentially would understand the risks and were taking real steps to defend these systems. Bloomberg reported that the CEOs of Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Goldman Sachs were all there. And other government officials in countries like the US, Canada, and the UK, they have all now met with banking officials to discuss exactly this threat. Now, why are exactly banks so worried? Really, there are 3 reasons. The first one is that, put simply, that's where the money is. So it's always been a prime target for cyber attacks, obviously. And for that reason, there's really an imperative to be able to protect banks. The second is that the banking industry runs on old technology for their security infrastructure. A lot of these systems were built first decades ago and have been patched over and updated as time went by. So think of essentially an old building that might have a very old foundation, but you keep renovating it without having the actual foundation being renewed. And finally, banking is heavily regulated, which means that a lot of banks, they would use the same vendors, which are regulatory approved, and they have the same software solution. So one breach would not necessarily stay contained. It could cascade and the damage could spread across the entirety of the industry, affecting ordinary people's bank accounts, as well as more large-scale investors who have a lot of financial skin in the game. As one consultant put it,
the real fear here is that bad actors, criminals, state-backed hackers could exploit some of these systemically important banks. So these are the biggest banks on Wall Street, the biggest banks in the world. If bad actors can exploit their vulnerabilities, that could destabilize the financial system.
So where does this leave us? Now, there's a few points that people have been made that are worth exploring. The first thing is that there's been a lot of discussion that, oh, have we now reached AGI again? Which I think is, again, kind of beside the point, because first of all, AGI is, first of all, a theoretical concept. And the second thing is that these kinds of ideas, these kinds of terminologies do not really help us understand the actual capabilities. An AI system can do both great benefit as well as great harm without being necessarily classified as an AGI system. The other point that I think has been unexplored quite strongly is the fact that Mythos might have the potential of not only creating harm within financial institutions and with national security, but also within biological weapons and being able to design them. That remains an area that within AI safety has been largely unexplored. But potentially the most important point, and this is really the message that I want to leave you with today, is that this is not really a story about Anthropic. Now, every single study, whether that's in upskilling for labor markets, whether it's about educating young people, whether it's in establishing national technological sovereignty, or whether that's about building security infrastructure, every single one documents, like I and several other experts have been doing over the past decades, that we're behind, that there's a major gap that keeps getting bigger and wider every single day. This is the nth warning that we have to finally move. What it will take for us to do so, I'm honestly not quite sure. But in the meantime, I'll be here to support upskilling people and organizations, and I'll keep documenting developments as they arise. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this content interesting, make sure to subscribe. I'd love to know from you, do you think Mythos is just a marketing scoop, or do you see it as something that is actually much bigger? Let me know in the comment section, and I look forward to seeing you back very soon.